While the structure of government may be clear on paper, what happens in practice is often vastly different. The Prime Minister is at the top, with chiefs of staff pulling the strings behind the scenes and voters holding members of parliament accountable. At least in theory. From Stephen Harper's strategically centralized PMO to Katie Telford's influence on former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, history is full of examples where unelected advisors shape the country's direction as much as elected officials. Welcome to Off Script with New West. I'm Shannon Greer, and joining me today to talk about what really happens in the halls of the House of Commons is Dr. Ian Brodie, Senior Advisor at New West, Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary, and the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. As well, we have Jon Dugal, a Senior Consultant at New West who has held senior roles at the Liberal Party of Canada's national headquarters. Thank you both for being here today. Really grateful to have you and to hear your insights.
Good to be here, Shannon.
Excited.
Well, we know that the news cycle has basically been nonstop since Prime Minister Mark Carney first got elected. So I want to take a second to slow down, zoom out, and talk about what's happening behind the scenes. Ian, we'll start with you. Let's talk about what does the day-to-day decision-making look like in Ottawa, regardless of who's in power?
The whole system is built around the Prime Minister's preference for how centralized or decentralized he wants his government to be. The first thing the Prime Minister has to decide is what issues he wants to run himself, what issues he wants to be consulted on, and what issues he wants to leave to others. The federal government's a huge operation. There's 350,000, 400,000 people on staff. It has a wide range of responsibilities. The Prime Minister can't do everything. And so despite stories you hear where everything goes to the PM's office or everything goes to a PMO, that's not really true. It could not be true. The federal government wouldn't operate if it ran. So the first thing a Prime Minister has to do is decide what are the issues where I want to play a role and what are the issues that I want to delegate to other people. The federal government, the civil service, and political staff have a way of making sure that he is abreast of what he needs to know on other issues. It seems that Mr. Carney's decided he's got a core group of economic development issues where he wants to be the lead player. That's fine. He'll have some ministers that he can make use of as needed to drive those ahead. And on the other issues that might have concerned Mr. Trudeau on social affairs, on cultural affairs, and so forth, it seems these are not the issues that really drive Mr. Carney's time in politics. He's prepared to leave those to others. And the system, it seems to me, has accommodated his priorities.
Okay, you've touched on a good point. And Jon, I think this is a good opportunity for you to weigh in because you worked with both the former Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister. Can you talk a little bit about the management styles, the shift going from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney, and how that's playing into what we're seeing today?
Yeah, well, look, I think the shift in style is going to be felt, especially by ministers and especially by senior staff around the table. Whereas the last government definitely had a bit more control at the very executive level of the Prime Minister's office over the day-to-day operations of the cabinet. This one seems like it's going to be a little bit more unentangled from that perspective. The Prime Minister is obviously going to set out the prerogatives. He's obviously going to set the agenda from a day-to-day perspective. And quite frankly, he's going to weigh in heavily on matters of policy. He will make decisions that guide the country in a certain direction. However, from an implementation perspective, there is definitely an approach that is a bit more hands-off in that perspective. And he's allowing the ministers to come up with their own plans, come back to him, report on progress, and then take it from there. And I think that's evidenced by just the way he's approached cabinet in general. For example, he doesn't approach cabinet retreats as they were called in the past. He approaches them as cabinet planning forums. Therefore, we are setting the agenda, we are setting the course, and everybody will be setting their plan of action from there. So I think that's a very different tone and very different style than what Trudeau would have brought in before him.
Ian, maybe we'll throw this one back to you. So can you talk about some of the big events that are coming up, including the budget? These are things that happen every year, regardless of who's in power. But where are there decision points where the PMO and only the PMO can weigh in? John's saying that cabinet is maybe more of a factor than it has been in the past, but we know that some of those decisions have to be centralized.
Ottawa, no matter who's in charge, you're right, has a certain annual cycle to it. The Prime Minister can make some decisions about the timing of a budget, the timing of parliamentary sessions up to a point. But really, there's an expectation around Ottawa that the annual cycle will follow the usual pattern. Usually there's a fall economic statement by the finance minister that's sometimes referred to as a mini budget. This year it's referred to as a budget. I'm not sure the nomenclature actually matters that much, but there is a cluster of decisions around how the federal government's going to raise its money. So in other words, what are we going to make changes to the tax law? And how is the federal government going to spend its money in the big chunks that can come in the fall economic update? This year it's a budget. And then the usual budget cycle, which is end of February, beginning of March, ordinarily. The finance minister has the lead in drafting that budget, of course, but the big decisions have to be, that the big decisions have implications across the government. And so the prime minister really has to be closely involved in deciding what are the big issues in the budget and what are the big decisions. There'll be, I don't know what the cutoff is this year, but decisions above probably $500 million will go to the prime minister automatically. Then there's usually in the fall a throne speech in the beginning of a parliamentary session. This year it doesn't look like we're going to get a throne speech in the fall, but that's another decision-making point where the prime minister and the prime minister's office writes that speech. And it may not be paid close attention to outside of Ottawa. In fact, I never really met anybody outside of Ottawa who reads a throne speech unless they're in our business and public affairs. But everybody around Ottawa reads that throne speech to say, because they know that the prime minister's office has taken the lead in writing it. What are the top 4 or 5 issues that the prime minister and the PMO are worried about this year? And those are going to be the priorities of the government going forward. There are some other points during the year, the week before the Christmas break for the House of Commons, the week before the spring break for the House of Commons. There'll be some decisions about what legislation you want to make compromises about in order to get it through the system. Those will come up to the PM for involvement as well, because you got to say no to some ministers who got their legislation through the cabinet process, introduced it to the House, but unfortunately it's not passing this spring or this year. But those are more tactical decisions. I would say the big ones are the big budget decisions, the big economic update, and the big introduction to the parliamentary session. Those are the ones, the tea leaves that we all read through to see what is the prime minister really thinking about what his government's going to do this year.
I'm based in Alberta, so I'm a bit biased, but I find it interesting that, you, Ian, came from a government where the prime minister was Western based. Of course, we haven't seen this with the Liberals recently, but you do see Mark Carney really trying to incorporate the West, having the cabinet planning sessions out West, having the major projects office out West. How do you think this is going to play in the East versus West as we get further into the session? And how do different governments deal with this? Because certainly it's been an issue forever.
Yes, I mean, this is the consistent issue of Canadian politics, is how to manage the regional dimension of politics. That said, I think Carney's economic influence makes this balancing act or this kind of political compromise much easier. There's an economic growth agenda for the country that involves Western resources, Western infrastructure, has national implications. The projects of national influence or national importance that he's trying to settle, some of them will be in Western Canada. He needs the growth that comes from that. So I think he's got, for the next year or so, at least because of this dominant economic growth agenda, a bit of an easier time balancing the provinces amongst each other in his agenda. I think he set himself a careful agenda here that makes his federal provincial issues a bit easier to manage. The challenge here in Alberta, of course, is the Premier has set an agenda for a series of referendums in the spring. That helps Carney, I think, because it helps him with setting deadlines for everybody else around the cabinet table. He knows he has to have something for those referendums we're going to have in the spring of 2026 here, and that helps him, if you want, carry the whip hand for the rest of his cabinet to say, yeah, we need to get this delivered by November, December, January. Otherwise, we're going to have other problems in Alberta. But if he can make that piece of the puzzle work, I think he's got a fairly light federal provincial agenda that's helped by his economic focus.
Jon, I'm interested in your perspective because you're based in Ottawa, so you bring that more Eastern perspective to this conversation. What do you think about this topic?
Well, I bring an even more Eastern perspective than that, having been from Prince Edward Island, right? So I see the regional dichotomies at play. And in fact, there's plenty of people in the Atlantic Canada region that would say that they haven't gotten a fair shake for, well, pretty well since the date of birth for Canada. So when you look at that, it very much is pitting one region against the other. But to Ian's point, there's a lot of the prime minister's core economic plan is going to have to go through the West. There's no two ways about it. But from a very political perspective too, this is going to be a really important region. the Liberal government is not far off from a majority. They're only a couple of seats down. And when you look at the map compared to before the election, in fact, they lost an incumbent seat in Calgary. And there were a couple star candidates that they had across Calgary and Edmonton where they would have felt pretty confident about their odds to take at least a seat or two across the two major urban areas. And so that's going to be part and parcel to the government's approach to winning seats in the next election and going from a minority to a majority. So just those calculations alone are going to be incredibly important to the prime minister. But also, you look at the moment in time that we're in, it is a unique moment where the prime minister had an opportunity to reset effectively on federal, provincial, territorial relations because of the threats that were coming at us from abroad, both from aggressors overseas in terms of how they were disrupting global markets and global security arrangements, but also just south of the border. This all created a confluence where the prime minister could look at it and he said, okay, I have an opportunity to shape the chessboard in a way that I see fit, to reshape relationships at the provincial and territorial level, to help myself get across to the economic agenda that I'm trying to implement and fulfill. And I think that's going to be critical to how he approaches just domestic affairs in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this will be an interesting sort of topic to balance. I want to sort of jump off this and talk about political scandals, which haven't really happened for this government yet. They're so new. So some of the issues Mark Carney is dealing with is more of kind of working with the premiers and balancing the East West. But we know that the longer people are in power, the more likely it is that something very big is going to happen and they're going to be in a crisis communication situation. Ian, I want to start with you. You've seen this a few times before. What does it look like behind the scenes when a crisis happens? How much are political staff taking the wheel, and how much are elected officials doing that?
Look, any of the scandals that really hurt a government are ones that involve cabinet ministers or the prime minister himself. In this case, I would have to say, despite what I just said about Mr. Carney, and I agree with John's assessment of the overall political situation here, Mr. Carney's background in the private sector means he has continuing financial connections to all of the biggest companies in Canada. He kind of didn't quite come up front during the election campaign about how much of these companies he owns personally.
What happens is that there's a discussion with the ethics commissioner for certain screens around certain issues, and that's a process that is underway.
And although he's put his finances into a blind trust, his ownership is so big, he knows what he owns and what he doesn't own. That's inevitably going to be a difficulty for him to manage his conflicts of interest. And I think this is if I had to guess, this is going to be the part where the scandals first erupt. In that case, because it deals with the prime minister or with cabinet ministers themselves, you have to rely on staff to have an independent view here. It's very difficult for ministers in particular to step out of their own shoes and say, am I the problem here? Is my conduct the problem here? There are some ministers that can do that, but for the fact of the matter is most ministers can't. And prime ministers have difficulty with that as well. In this case, this is where you need to depend on staff to be able to take a slightly outsider's perspective here, independent view, to connect to what the average person thinks. It's difficult for staff because they work in a bit of a bubble as well, and to come up with plans for mitigating the problems here. I would say if I had to identify a exacerbating factor here, Mr. Carney's reached outside of normal staffing channels to have a chief of staff, a principal secretary, and a clerk of the Privy Council who really don't fit the Ottawa mold. But in a sense, they may not be able to give him the completely independent perspective that he needs if he gets into trouble like this. And I'll look forward over the next couple of months if that's an area where the Conservatives, as they recalibrate their agenda, are able to make some hay at Mr. Carney's personal expense here. Other ministers, it's nice to have scandals to deal with other ministers, but frankly, most Canadians don't follow cabinet and don't know the names of other cabinet ministers. If there's a general smoke that there's a corruption problem inside the government, that would hurt. But scandals here that go to Mr. Carney's own ownership position, the extent to which his priorities are benefiting companies where he has a major ownership position and can enrich himself. That's an set of issues I'd be very concerned about if I was in the Carney PMO. It's not clear to me that yet, because we haven't seen it yet, Mr. Carney has taken all the steps needed to have people around him that can help him through that with a genuinely independent view of what his exposure is there.
John, maybe we'll turn it over to you because we know that while the PMO has changed over, to Ian's point, there's quite a few new faces. A lot of the other staff are still the same. People have stuck around from the Trudeau era and are still there. Certainly, there were a number of crisis communication situations under Trudeau. How do you see those folks playing into when something happens, or how do you think that that relationship will work out as you sort of have folks who have more experience and those who are maybe learning the role as they go?
Well, I think more than anything, it sets up an interesting dichotomy, right? Because obviously you do want gray hairs around the room as a matter of speaking. You want people that have had that lived experience, even relatively recently, whether it was 3, 4 years ago or 6, 7 years ago, or just yesterday, for example, right? So there has to be that mix of people in there. But one of the trappings that I would be looking at that the prime minister himself could be putting himself into, let alone other cabinet ministers, is are your people fresh enough? Because to Ian's point, one of the most important things that you can do to have that outsider's perspective is actually bring in outsiders. And it's not to say that they've never held that job before. It's not to say that they've come from a different profession to bring in a different line of thinking. Okay, there are skill sets there that are required to work at the executive levels of government, especially in the prime minister's office. However, has your team, especially at the mid range at the junior level, have they been in that Ottawa bubble for the last 6, 7 years? Therefore, have they developed a bit of a hive mind when it comes to these things? Have they forgotten what it really feels like to sit at the kitchen table, whether it's in Charlottetown or Winnipeg or Calgary or Vancouver, and to have those conversations with their moms, with their dads, with their neighbors to say, how does this decision impact you? How does that decision impact you? How does this crisis impact you? What really matters to the average voter out there outside of the Ottawa bubble? So I think one of the trappings that he'll want to avoid, and this goes to, kind of issues management 101, is kneecap the issue before it even becomes an issue. So I think there's two prerogatives there, right? The decision makers have to have a really clear reflection of themselves, a really clear reflection of where their own trappings are, to Ian's point. Decisions that the government makes could implicate Prime Minister Carney from a financial perspective based on his holdings from the past. And so you need to know where the holes are. You need to know how to avoid those pitfalls. But the second imperative there is obviously to make sure that, yes, you have that mix of experience and the gray hairs that are around, and remember, the process that you put into place to manage a crisis, but then having a few people around as well that may have been involved 10 years ago, 8 years ago, but maybe have taken a couple of years away from the hill now, that are bringing that maybe more grocery store aisle perspective to things whenever decisions are being made.
Okay. And we know that when these things happen, these folks all get together in a room, they're talking about it. But parallel to that, so is the opposition. They're huddling to talk about how they can make hay. We know that Pierre Poilievre and his team are talking about what they're going to do going into this session. So maybe let's talk a little bit about that. What do you see as the opposition's role? How is that structured, and how does it differ between parties? Ian, we'll start with you.
Uh, I hate to be professorial about it, but the opposition's role is to oppose. So from time to time, you see in the editorial pages of the newspapers or on some CBC panel, oh, we need more constructive suggestions about how to govern the country from the opposition. Nonsense. The opposition's job is to oppose. That's why it's called the opposition. Mr. Poilievre is very good at this. He sort of, over the course of 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 or 6 years, honed himself into the perfect opponent of Justin Trudeau. The only problem with this plan was that Justin Trudeau didn't run for re-election the way he had hoped. He was right now spending his time every hour of his waking day with his closest advisors, trying to turn himself into the same perfect weapon of opposition against Mr. Carney. Will he be able to do it? I don't know. I have been surprised, to be honest, that the conflict of interest issues with Mr. Carney haven't been front and center in the Conservative attack since the election in the spring. Of course, Mr. Poilievre was off trying to get his seat back in the House of Commons, running in this by-election here in rural Alberta. But now that he's back in the House of Commons and focused full time, I expect to see in the fall, there's a trial and error to this. You don't know when you're in the bubble what's going to resonate with people, what's going to resonate with the media, what the government's going to fumble, to be honest, what it's going to fail in its issues management. system to manage very well. So I would expect to see September, October, November, a whole range of spitballs being spit at the government. An immigration issue, a financial issue, a conflict of interest issue, a crime issue, a whole series of cost of living issues. The Conservative front bench out throwing all sorts of spitballs at the government to see what sticks. And then we'll know by December, I think, which ones are vulnerabilities for the Carney government and which ones aren't. Those to develop in 2006. I don't see an election between now and Christmas for sure. I'm not even sure I see an election in 2026. And so they have some time here to play out, to experiment a little bit. Mr. Poilievre, of course, faces his own internal party leadership review here in the middle of January. That won't be far from his mind either. He himself has got to cluster his attacks on issues that protect his flanks inside the party for that review in January. I don't think anybody inside Mr. Poilievre's camp is taking it for granted that he's going to win that leadership review. They shouldn't. Having done Mr. Harper's leadership review in 2005 myself, I know these things are ugly, and so I'm sure they're plotting that out. Well, if he passes that, I expect him to. Then for spring of 2026 into the summer of 2026, after a period of experimentation, a little bit more focus on the attacks.
Now, Jon, as Ian's alluded to, this is a very different matchup between Poilievre and Carney v. Poilievre and Trudeau. Jon, how do you see this playing out over the next few months?
I think Mark Carney's going to try to take a slow and boring approach, to be quite frank. I think the more that he can do that, the more he can stay in his element, just be the executive, be there, be the leader, be a visionary to an extent too. He does have a combative side. We've seen that throughout the campaign. He can, even in the House, he's gotten into it a few times with the opposition. But the more that he can stay calm, cool, collected, I think the more that he's going to be able to, A, get under Pierre Poilievre's skin, but B, to an extent, start putting out those fires before they can even come up. I do think that the war machines for each party are going to be revving at max capacity. I find it interesting that the Liberal Party effectively for 2 years let Pierre Poilievre skate by without really trying to define him, without really launching a lot of opposition research on him. And of course, the Conservatives, whether they had it or didn't, but they didn't really launch anything on Mark Carney throughout the campaign. You could, again, to Ian's point earlier about finding those financial ties, those kind of ties to decisions the government is making, trying to throw those at the wall, see what sticks. I think we'll see a fair bit of that over the fall session because they're going into his own leadership review. If the Liberals are able to paint him in a certain way or able to get a few selective stories out there that may not resonate very well with his base or with the general public, perhaps his review vote is not as high as they would anticipate, and it creates a little external and internal pressure on Pierre Poilievre as well. So I think, that dual-headed approach of trying to stay calm, but under the water, I think those flutters are going to be kicking very fast for both of the parties.
And we'll see how much we see splashes. Sorry, Ian, did you want to jump in on that?
I think Jon's basically right here, but let me push a little bit further. I think one of Mr. Carney's weaknesses so far, he hasn't paid a price for it, but I think it's showing up, is yes, he likes to stay out of the media. He likes to stay out of the daily cut and thrust of politics. I think that's good. I think Mr. Trudeau was too in fault in that. The flip side of that is he doesn't like to explain himself. He's had a summer of trips to Europe. Why is he in Europe? What are we trying to do in Europe? Why does he spend all this time overseas? He hasn't really told us. He's made decisions about trade policy with the United States. Some of those have taken us by surprise. What is his strategy for dealing with the United States? What is he trying to accomplish? How does he see current trade disputes folding into the renegotiation of the new NAFTA next year? What does he think? He said everything's going to change. Everything's going to change in what way? What does he think is going on here? He hasn't taken time. In fact, he never takes time to sit down and try to explain to people what he's doing. And therefore, I think he's left public opinion and the public debate lagging a little bit. That's going to be a problem for him going forward unless he finds some comfortable way. He obviously hasn't found a comfortable way yet of sitting down to explain to the public what the hell is he up to. We don't really know. He doesn't take time to explain that. That has been okay so far, but as he gets into choppier political waters over the course of the coming year, I think if he continues on that path, that's going to be a weakness of his that will leave people wondering, does he really have a plan? Who's really in charge here? What should we expect next? I think that's a problem I would watch for the future.
And I think that the further that we get into fall, the more important that's going to be because, quite frankly, during the summer season, most people are taking their vacation. So I think, I personally would give him a little bit of a pass for at least anything Canada Day onwards from that perspective, in terms of some of the travel. But I think Ian's right. Like, now is the time for business. You had your junkets over the summer to start setting up what you want to be announceables into the fall and into the winter session. So now it's time for the rubber to meet the road, and it's time to really get out there and explain exactly, to Ian's point, what your plan is and how you're going to move forward.
Well, there is a lot to watch, and I think this is a good spot to end on because we are forward looking. As you said, Mark Carney has had a bit of an easier time, but we're going to keep on top of this all throughout the fall. Thank you so much both for joining me and for sharing your perspectives on this important topic. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks for listening to Off Script with New West. Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.